And welcome to the Leave Us Alone podcast, the podcast that celebrates individual liberty. I'm Grover Norquist with Americans for Tax Reform. And today we're going to be talking about not just taxes and spending and Americans for Prosperity, and one of its leaders is with us today, but the whole panoply of the freedom issues and how they mesh together and live or die together. If you're new here, the show is about all those topics, and I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to understand that the Leave Us Alone Coalition is businessmen who don't want to be taxed too much, gun owners who don't want to have their Second Amendment rights violated, people who care about their freedom of religion, taxpayers who don't want higher taxes or to be regulated out of existence as a small businessman or woman, Second Amendment folks, homeschoolers, people in private school, most Americans. Anyone who votes on an issue that says, I want to be left alone by government, not I want the government to go steal something from somebody else and gives it to me, whether that's power, attention, or cash. Today, Gardner is with us. He's with the Americans for Prosperity, a wonderful nationwide group which fights for limited government on all levels. And Brent, when did Americans for Prosperity begin? There have been several groups that sort of it flowed out of. What do you have as your starting point in your mind as to for Americans for Prosperity or one of its beginners?
Yeah, Grover, thanks first of all for having me on. I appreciate it. You know, last year at the end of the year, we celebrated our 20th anniversary. So we are in our 20th year. We're very excited to have been here. And from that time, we've had a lot of great fights, and, you know, we've counted no better partner than Americans for Tax Reform in so many of those fights. But I think that's really where we got started about 20 years ago.
Today's news is the shutdown continues, partial shutdown continues. Could you give people your sense from Americans for Prosperity? What's the state of play? And you are heavily engaged now in trying to move Congress in a good direction or keep them in a good direction on the question of going back to the table and renegotiating everything.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we're in a really unfortunate spot right here. And it's not because of all of Congress. I mean, you know, I think many times this year, I'm fortunate enough to be able to say this, but I think the House of Representatives did their job. They passed a clean CR, you know, ultimately ensuring that we'd have the time to work through a longer appropriations process. They sent it over to the Senate. Since then, there's been 13 votes in an attempt to be able to keep the government open at first and then reopen the government. But Democrats in the Senate and Democrats really across the entire Beltway, you know, continue to look to be obstructionist and keep this government shut down. And quite frankly, Grover, the thing that's been shocking to me has been the willingness of Democrats to get out and say what they're actually thinking. They've said their quiet part out loud so often, which is, you know, whether it's saying, you know, obviously this shutdown is going to hurt some families, but apparently that's a trade-off that they're willing to make because this is their opportunity to get leverage. I've never seen this kind of politically craven stuff. But look, the pressure is certainly building now. Look, whether it's, you know, the American people who are, you know, suffering because they themselves are impacted, whether it's people who've been impacted by the loss of services, you know, across the board, we've got folks who just aren't getting paid. Government services are not happening. And I think the challenge here is, you know, over the past couple of weeks, we've seen a continued growth of that pressure. You know, the largest government employees union came out this week. SNAP benefits and on Saturday for millions of Americans. So many things are building up. And I think the pressure on Democrats is very real.
SNAP being the new word for food stamps.
Correct. Yep.
I always love the fact the Democrats have to rename their stuff every few years after people figure out what it is.
Yeah.
Liberal went to progressive because they drove liberal into the ground, but it only became liberal after they'd driven progressive into the ground in the 1940s.
Yeah. A lot of marketing.
So what do your ads say? And what is the goal there?
Yeah, I mean, we've been calling for folks to get back to reopening the government, getting back to the business of the American people. You know, there's a lot that really still has to be addressed and handled. And there was a packed legislative calendar before this all began. I mean, we were looking towards the possibility of dealing with some of the challenges this country faces on energy. We were looking at dealing on some of the issues around permitting, government overreach. One Big Beautiful Bill was an excellent victory. And I think members did a great job on that, but there was a lot of work to still be done. And so we want to get that back open. The other thing we're doing is we're calling out Democrats for what they're trying to make this an issue about. They've tried to make this about the Affordable Care Act subsidies that were exclusively passed by Democrats during the pandemic with this selected end date upcoming, which, by the way, doesn't happen until the end of the year. And now Democrats have tried to make this the issue of the government being open or closed. At the end of the day, it's been such a craven thing that they've been searching for. We've been calling them out on this stuff. And so, I think that's a big part of it. And, we can talk about this if you want to, but, some of the stuff that came out from CMS yesterday, the claims that they're making aren't even true. And so, it's really been about trying to get people who are looking for an outlet to try and deal with the fact that Democrats really own this shutdown, to encourage them to come back to the table, to get the CR passed, and to return government to something that works.
So the Democrats extended the subsidies for Obamacare. They needed subsidies because Obamacare, which was supposed to make healthcare cost less, has ended up being a period where healthcare costs have gone up, not down, as happens with education when you subsidize it and other things. When the government subsidizes something, prices go up, not down. Okay, it was supposed to end in January 1st of this year by their own rules. What happens on January 1st? What do the Democrats say that they want to fix, that they didn't fix before, that they didn't care to fix before, in their view, fixed? And what's reality?
Yeah, I mean, they're not even getting into the specifics of what they'd like to do. What they want to see right now is a full extension. I mean, they're asking for a massive expenditure on being able to extend the program as it is right now. That's not realistic. They're also asking for, as a condition of reopening the government, elimination of provisions that were passed during the One Big Beautiful Bill that would have made one of the options available for people going forward in HSA for 1.6 million people. So, I mean, they're looking to continue to double down on the same policies that haven't worked, to find ways to continue to pour government dollars into systems that are not functioning. And they're really not looking for reforms that give us an opportunity to ensure that healthcare becomes affordable in this country again. And so some of the claims they're making are abjectly false. Other ones are just a continued, dedication to the policies that really have gotten us to where we are today.
How does this play out? How do you see it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that's been really heartening at this point is that Republicans, unlike in some of these fights in the past, have remained united in this. There is, across the ideological spectrum, and let's acknowledge there is an ideological spectrum amongst Republicans, moderates to, folks who are perhaps the most conservative. There's folks that represent every part of this, including some Democrats who have said, we're not going to negotiate on the ACA subsidies. They recognize the long-term hazard of continuing these things. And so the public statements have been good. I think we've seen the White House come out and offer a very strong opposition this week. And so I think that issue at least goes to bed for this first section, the reopening of the first government. And I think once we get past Election Day on Tuesday and Democrats feel like they have something good to talk about, it's very likely that they'll come back and reopen the government. A couple of questions remain, though. How long? So the current bill that the Senate has only takes them until November 21st. So we're really talking about a very short period of time that they would have to renegotiate. There's some discussions about extending that as far as March, from what I've heard. But regardless, we're going to be back in this discussion again. And whether or not they look for a minibus or an Omni or something at the end of the year, we'll see. But I think the pressure's stacking up, Grover. I think, honestly, they're going to have to reopen, and we're going to have to readdress this at some point in the near future or the midterm future.
Now, the Democrats are a minority in the House and the Senate. What we passed on the Big Beautiful Bill were the tax cuts and some of the spending changes that they want to alter. If nothing happens on November 21st, what happens?
Yeah, I think there's some question. I mean, I think, the challenge is that some of the things that have traditionally happened during a shutdown have functioned a little bit differently. And so, generally speaking, people stopped getting paid. I think the administration's done some creative stuff to find ways to try and keep those things going, but the money eventually runs out. And so we'll continue to see a reduction at that point in the level of government services, in what areas and what sectors. And I couldn't tell you that, but I definitely think that we'll continue to see this. One thing that I think is also interesting, in addition to just the mechanics, though, is where the American people are. AFP is a grassroots organization, so we spend a lot of our time on the phones with the American people, not just focused on the government. And if you look at some of the polling this week from CNN, since the government shutdown started, Democrats have fallen to a 20-year low in their approval rating, and Republicans have actually seen a lift in how they're seen. So in addition to the mechanics of what happens for folks with the impact of these cascading shutdowns, the opinions of the American people are shifting during this time as they see what the conflicting visions are.
So during the shutdown period, which we're a month into, right? The Democrats have become less popular. The Republicans have strengthened. And yet I keep hearing or being told by the establishment press that polling says that by 2 or 3 points, people say, I blame the Republicans, not the Democrats. How does one, is it that there are just so many other issues and the shutdown is one of them? And that's why Republicans are gaining, if according to these polls, people on the margin, it's not a big number, but seem to a little bit, prefer they blame the Republicans more than the Democrats for the shutdown. I suppose if you liked the shutdown, that might be a reason to be a Republican. But you would think that would tend to make the Republicans go down and the Democrats go up, and yet the overall number is the opposite. How do you read that? Because I'm not sure how to understand that those numbers are going in the opposite way of what CBS is trying to tell me they should.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, listen, I think there's a couple of things at play here. One, I think Republicans have done a much better job talking about why they've done what they've done. And quite frankly, they have a lot to be able to talk about. They've done their job. They passed it out of the House. They put it in the Senate. Republicans have voted as a bloc in support on these things. So I think there's a different message, and there's been message consistency on this. The other thing is I think Democrats are increasingly, as time goes on, they're finding themselves in front of the camera and saying things that Americans don't like. And so, the mainstream media has had a narrative for a long time, but, CNN is not exactly a bastion of conservative thought. And when their folks have to get out there and talk about these numbers in reality, and they're starting to see some of them have frustration with Democrats who are issuing talking points, I think Americans are watching that. And I think Americans who are increasingly hurt by this are going to look at those facts, are looking at those facts, and over time are realizing, that Democrats are really punishing the American people for the losses that they dealt them in the last election cycle. And so I think Republicans have to do a good job of messaging that, of sharing with the American people the truth. And as they are, I think that's why they're seeing the lift.
Is there going to be another reconciliation package? There was the one big, beautiful bill. And when that was passed, or as that was being passed, the Speaker of the House pointed out that there will likely be 2 more, one in the fall now and one in the spring. Thune said maybe one in the spring, maybe not 2, but 1 or 2, where we could go back and with a simple majority in the House and the Senate and a presidential signature, we could reduce spending, we could reduce taxes, we could bring health savings accounts and make them stronger and make them better off. Where do you see that now? Because they're back into not discussing how many, 2, 1. And I guess the other question is, if the Supreme Court strikes down the president's tariffs that he put in unilaterally, as opposed to ones that came in through Congress, then he might want to use that, the reconciliation package, to visit that issue, which might be more difficult to get enough Republican votes in the Senate to get it across the finish line. Are you hearing from people that we're expecting 1 or 2? What would you like to see in the package, if there is one?
I think there's at least a second one that should be on deck. Look, there's a lot of stuff that we wanted to accomplish in the first one that we were unable to, that wound up on the cutting room floor. And I think that there's no shortage of goals that we could accomplish utilizing budget reconciliation. If there's an opportunity to do 2, I would love to see that. There should be at least 1. And I think, like you, we heard signals as we were coming down the home stretch of the One Big Beautiful Bill that not only did they want to do one, but that they were starting to look at the people that were going to help try and put together the base package. And so, we've submitted some ideas. I think there's some great opportunities there for us, whether it's in the healthcare space, whether it's in, the spending space, which we don't feel like we have addressed substantially enough, but are hopeful that we can. There's a number of reforms that we could utilize budget reconciliation for, use that lower threshold of 50 plus 1 plus the president's signature to get it across the line. I think, quite frankly, the one complicating factor here is that as we remove days from the calendar because Congress isn't open, all of the tasks that were there didn't go away. We're not going to do them. They're just going to become a compressed time frame. And so keeping a focus on the need to be able to utilize reconciliation to accomplish some of these goals is a big part of what we plan on doing as soon as Congress comes back to town. I know, as you do, that members of the conservative coalition, folks who are actively working on these issues, have got a laundry list of things that we can do there. And I think the speaker, to his credit, has done a great job of trying to source what those things look like. But it's going to require the pressure of the American people to actually get it over the line.
What jumps out at you as the one or two, three most interesting things that could be in reconciliation number 2?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think we've done a lot along the lines of what the 2017 bill was. I think there's other provisions that we have. I mean, I think we probably have opportunities to really deal with HSAs, to deal with some things in the healthcare space. I think some of the issues.
I'm excited about that too.
Yeah, I think those types of things are the type of transformation that we need to be able to do. I think there's some other big things out there that are possible. I think ultimately, we look at things like site neutral payments. There's a lot in that space, just given the size of the impact of healthcare on the economy, that probably isn't going to happen through a standalone bill that we can be looking at. I think there's a number of other provisions of things that are potentially out there for us to do. But honestly, we got to see where members' appetites are on this. I was a little disappointed during the One Big Beautiful Bill to not see folks who'd pressed on some of these areas in the past, advocate a little bit more strongly. But we had to be practical to ensure that we didn't go over the fiscal cliff. Now I'd love to see the kind of work that we know needs to be done to deal and control some of our spending, to ensure that our long-term fiscal health is part of how we're thinking through budget reconciliation. But I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see where these things come out.
Okay. You have also worked, in addition to the economic zone, worked with the National Rifle Association. Yeah. And we were talking just before we joined the podcast here at some of how busy it was as with the Leave Us Alone Coalition. Don't raise my taxes, don't attack my small business, don't steal my property, but also leave my Second Amendment rights alone, worked in that zone. Can you talk about some of your successes there, and also some of the efforts you had to build a coalition with the Second Amendment with other groups that had some, but not all the success that you wanted?
Yeah, I was incredibly proud of my time to work for the National Rifle Association. It's not the easiest issue to work, and it certainly wasn't back then, but some of the issues that we were able to be successful on, we finally got concealed carry across the line in the state of Wisconsin. We dealt with some of the challenges that came around self-defense laws and how they were treated at the time. We had opportunities to advance additional freedoms for folks, moving things from may issue to shall issue, ensuring that people can exercise their rights. We worked on hunting rights and ensuring that those things didn't come under attack. But, you talk about building the coalition. It was tough. I mean, people don't do a great job of advocating for their own rights sometimes. Fortunately, the NRA has got a great group of people who were incredibly active, and we were able to do things. But it was disappointing at times to not be able to build the type of broader coalitions which would have served not just firearms and people who enjoy their firearms freedoms, but, I'm reminded of a story, Grover, I think you and I talked about earlier, which we had a chance in Kansas to be able to pass a bill that, for folks who are paying attention to this podcast, they would have loved for a lot of reasons. It was saying that no state funds should be utilized for state lobbying against legal products. If the state deems it as legal, why should the state be out there lobbying against it? And, it should have brought in, at that time, it was Mike Bloomberg who was out there pushing for soda size bans. The tobacco industry was under attack on a whole lot of things. And obviously firearms was something that, depending on who the governor was and who the administration was, actively lobbied against the rights of their citizens. But it was tough. At the end of the day, we couldn't bring that coalition together effectively. And so the legislators who were willing to support that legislation eventually eliminated all the other components of it and just made it no state funds able to be able to lobby against firearms. And so, we lost an opportunity to be able to protect a much wider swath of things. Working in my time at NRA, the people who have the passion for the constitutional right of the Second Amendment, they belong to a lot of different organizations. And there were times where we didn't all come together on the same thing, but the times where we did, I got to really have a front row view of what happens when grassroots gets engaged and what we can actually do. Bills that were considered impossible, issues that were considered challenging, the incentives were made right for legislators, and you're not only working through the tiring process of getting laws passed, but then ultimately celebrating with those folks as they were able to ensure that their rights were protected. It was a really rewarding opportunity. And so whether it was permitless carry in Arizona, whether concealed carry in Wisconsin, whether it was hunters' rights in Kansas, there was amazing opportunities to see great strides made.
Americans for Prosperity is also working on permitting reform. I always worry the left has sort of said, oh yeah, we're for that too. which scares me because if they can be for it, it can't possibly really mean what I think it's supposed to mean. Um, what is when you say permitting reform? What do you mean? And do you share my concern that the left? One thing I've seen is they want to make it easy to permit for green energy, but not other things. So they'll call it permitting reform, but it really is just a subsidy for green energy, not most energy in the country, and not other things like building factories and roads and bridges. What is it? Is there a piece of legislation that Americans for Prosperity is focused on, or is there a theme? How would you articulate what you're focused on there?
Yeah, there's definitely a theme. Look, we've supported a lot of legislation over the years to deal with some of the bad regulatory frameworks that we've created for ourselves. I mean, I think we were all very excited for the Loper-Bright case in the Supreme Court and what that did for some of the regulatory challenges we found. But we still have things like NEPA, major challenges that we have. And I'll be honest with you, when I hear that the far left is interested in this as well, it gives me two things, concern and opportunity, because I agree. The left definitely wants to be able to see green projects come on board. But one of the things I'm most excited about over the last few years is, there's been a transition in the conversation that we've had around energy. If you look for like the past 15 to 20 years, the conversation has been traditional energy and green energy. And I think, listen, there's still people who really deeply care about that. And I think that's probably what's motivating our friends on the left. But the truth is today, the question is between enough and not enough energy. And so whether you are a Democrat that wants to see an electrification of the surface transportation fleet, or whether you are a Trump Republican that wants to see a reindustrialization of America, or whether you are a tech either side that wants to be able to see the AI revolution grow here in America, the truth is we don't have enough energy. We don't have enough generation. We don't have enough transmission. And the rules and regulations that we have around permitting these things are a massive problem. Democrats care a lot about transportation projects. They care a lot about green energy projects. Republicans care a lot about traditional energy. And at the end of the day, we know we just need more to be able to remain economically competitive in the world. So that transition of that conversation does create some opportunities for us to find partners on the left who are willing to look at this as an opportunity to get some of what they want and give Republicans some of what they want. But the truth is the current situation is challenging for us as a country because we've created frameworks that have made us non-competitive in the world. And so when you look at China, when you look overseas at the energy development that's happening, for us to remain competitive, we have to fix this problem.
Yeah, the left has at least said they're for permitting, so it'll be a little hard for them to demonize permitting reform. And when it gets on television, it'll be the permitting reform. And it may be the left piece of legislation, may be this little thing that's actually counter helpful. Or it could be everything you could possibly want. But I do think there may be some virtue to the fact that too many Democrats have said, yes, we need permitting reform, so that when permitting reform passes through a Republican House and a Republican Senate, because it's a law, it will have to have 60 votes on the Senate. That will tremendously limit what we can do. But the House will guarantee that it isn't it isn't a bad bill. Maybe a weaker bill than we'd like. Is there a bill with a name attached to it that you like, a congressman or a senator who, in your view, the guy people should be looking to for leadership?
I mean, look, when it comes to energy and energy permitting, I think the majority leader, Steve Scalise, has been the man on this. And I wouldn't look at a specific piece of legislation. We're trying really hard at this point to signal a need to be able to come up with something that we can actually get done. So laying hands on something where people have kind of gone down one side or the other, I wouldn't want to pick an existing piece of legislation. AFP has supported many pieces of these legislation in the past. Where we are today, though, is I think we've got a House of Representatives that is focused on the right things. And there's a lot of different packages. We need something that's viable on this, Grover. It's not enough for us to be able to make a point. We have to be able to make a difference here in this window at a time where I think Democrats have got a shifted incentive to find a way to do this. And Republicans, I think, have very clear eyes on where our biggest challenges are. And so I think we're looking at a new package that has contents from some of the existing bills that we've supported and perhaps some new stuff. We need to be able to ensure that we can bring on baseload generation. We need to ensure we can transmit that. And we need to ensure that we have a regulatory process and a legal process that doesn't allow this to be held up indefinitely in the way that it has between agencies and court cases. And if we can find a path to doing that, I think we can solve some of the biggest challenges facing, our states and our nation when it comes to energy, transportation, infrastructure, the whole nine yards.
How much can a state do? There's some things the federal government has to do. There's some things states can do to make themselves more competitive on permitting.
Yeah. States are still the laboratories of democracy. And so I think the opportunity for states to be able to continue to pilot and test things, the difference of how they utilize land and permitting in their states, there are big things that states can do and should be doing, and quite frankly, are doing in a lot of different places. But I think, look, when we look at some of the national challenges, we want to be able to have federal laws matching the opportunity for states to continue to experiment with new ways to be able to bring on these projects. So it's going to take a partnership of both. It's not one or the other. I think the window is very clearly defined currently at the federal level in a way that at the state level, it's just different state to state. But there is a role that both of them play. And the biggest thing that states can do is not get in the way of themselves. NIMBYism is a real problem when it comes to this. And I think states need to be able to continue to focus on ways to not make that a bigger problem.
Brent, how can people get involved with Americans for Prosperity? Do you have state chapters, local chapters? Do they have to send the note to Washington? How do they best reach out and get involved with Americans for Prosperity?
So americansforprosperity.org is the website to go to. We do have 37 state chapters that are active. We have a 50-state presence. So we have operations in all 50 states. Reaching out, we can connect you with our state directors. We have grassroots on the ground. We hold events throughout the states. We organize and join with partners like Americans for Tax Reform on efforts frequently. And so we have a lot of programming ongoing, but you can either reach out online, you can check out our social media. There's a lot of opportunities for folks to get active. And really, Grover, there's no time ever that's more important than it is right now to take advantage of the clarity that we have in our mission and our focus on what we need to do to get done. And we've got the operations, the activities, and the people on the ground to get it done. So I recommend people look us up online, reach out to their state teams, their state directors, get active. And I think that's the best way to do it.
I was just up in New Hampshire 2 days ago, and Americans for Prosperity had in New Hampshire, in the basement of this beautiful large bar restaurant, a lot of people there, a lot of state legislators, and you had a representative from New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, and then I was representing sort of what's happening in other states on tax policy. And the Maine guy said, well, back in the 1940s, we were just as good as New Hampshire, and New Hampshire stayed there and we wandered off into silliness. They now have rather high, like it's a 7% income tax, New Hampshire, none. And you're asking people to move to the place that's colder than New Hampshire. But it was very interesting to see the New England states each discussing what worked and how they saw the competition between the various states there. And so that the Americans for Prosperity, and they do this every several weeks or so, brings together a lot of activists and people to listen to a fascinating debate. I thought it was very interesting to hear these guys go back and forth. And then people from New Hampshire got to ask questions of the various folks there. It was a great project.
Awesome. Yeah, look, at AFP, people are our platform. That's the way that we're ultimately able to affect so much. And we bring these folks together all over the country. As a kid who grew up in Western New York, I can sympathize with the guy from Massachusetts. When I went to other states and did work with folks, it's tough to look uphill. But one of the great things is, with a little bit of work, you have an opportunity to turn things around. I think of my time working in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the land of Jim Doyle until Scott Walker came along. And so, the opportunity to be a platform for people to be able to make a change in their states, we have a lot of work to do. And so I'm glad you were able to join us in New Hampshire. And it's time to roll up our sleeves and find a way to solve some of the biggest challenges we face today.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Brent. This is fun to listen to you as the gun maestro, as well as economic policy with Americans for Prosperity, active in all 50 states. And I know we run into AFP leadership in states all the time when Americans for Tax Reform is working on specific projects as well. I hope people listening will rate this and review it and comment on it so that others can get a chance to see it. And between now and when we meet again, keep fighting for limited government. Remember what Americans for Prosperity and Americans for Tax Reform do, to fight for the right to simply be left alone by your government. Thank you. Thank you, Brent.
Thanks, Greg.